Good morning everyone, and welcome to our May tutorial of our Iron Giant image. This is our giant robot image, and I went with a horizontal format for this one versus a vertical format. I normally go vertical because it shares better on social media, but with this one I didn't think I'd have enough space to fit the entire robot hand if I went with the vertical format, so horizontal it is. It's still the same size, 8 by 10 size, around the 5,000 by 4,000 pixels. And how I started this one was I just dropped in the sky that I had here with the starry sky. And right here I had to fix the amount of grain that was on that particular stock image. And there's a lot of grain, so I just wanted to soften it a little bit, so I just went into our reduce noise, which is up in the filters. So you go to filter, noise, reduce noise, and you will find that smart filter there. The next piece of stock I brought in was the clouds and the moon. And all I did was I went to layer and then duplicate layer and then just put down that it was going into our new Mason robot file. And with these ones, I just blended the skies together as best as I could. They're pretty close in color already, and I just wanted a little bit of the clouds and the moon in there. So I just added a layer mask on the cloud layer, and with a black brush just painted off as much as I wanted. And once I had it how I liked it, all I had to do was make a couple of color adjustment layers to blend the skies even more together. And the next piece of stock that I brought in were these trees. Because they are a silhouette and they're all black, it was quite simple to select them. All I did was use a color selection layer. And so you go up to select and you go to color range, and I just selected the black, and it selects it out perfectly that way. I like to feather my selections a little bit, so I went into select, modify, and then you can go into just giving it a little bit of a blur. You only need it at about 1%. It just softens the edges of your selection, and then you can just drag and drop it into your image that you're editing. Don't forget to right-click your layers and turn them into smart objects before resizing any of these stock images that you're dropping into your image. We don't want to resize them without turning them into a smart object first, because then it can cause some pixelation. And I just used a brightness and contrast layer and clipped it to the sky layer just so I could even out the color tone and blend the cloud layer into the sky layer a little bit better. Alright, and the robot is actually from Pixel Squid, and I made a little folder with all of the stock that I wanted to use from Pixel Squid. This is the robot I used, and so I just had to change it to a profile. Of course, with all of my stock from Pixel Squid, I turn off the shadows and I always turn them to high resolution. Okay, and then all of Pixel Squid stock gets put in as a smart filter already, or smart object already. So all I had to do was resize it, and I wasn't quite sure at first what size I wanted to make this robot, but I knew I wanted it to be holding my son in his hand. So I knew it had to be like from the shoulders up-ish, around there. So I had to resize it to be really big for this one. So that's what I'm doing right here. And once I got it to where I wanted it, I had to go into the stock that I got from Adobe of the robot hand. So this is an Adobe stock image, and so I just had to select it out, and I actually used the remove background from the properties panel to do that. And I did have to also create a lot of puppet warp on this hand to make sure that it was at the right angle so it matched, so it looked like it was part of the robot. And once I got the hand at the right angle, I did need to do a little bit of puppet warp on the robot's head because I did want him to be looking at his hand, so looking more downwards than his head was actually placed from the stock. Then I just made a few extra tweaks on the hand and the background to make sure that everything was looking the way I wanted it to be. I'm just going to add the brightness and contrast layers to these, the robot and the hand, just to make sure that they are matching. Obviously right now the hand is like super bright, and because they are going to be shadowed more from the moonlight, they need to be quite dark. So I just made a clipping mask of a brightness and contrast layer on both of these, and adjusted the tone so that they looked like they fit in the scene. So before I made any more adjustments, I did have some more stock that I wanted to add in. Because they are walking through a forest, I wanted to make sure that there was some trees in front of them to make it look like they're going through the trees in the forest. And then I did have the little suitcase, the money, my son, and the chocolate bar to drop in. And I always like to place my stock first to know where I want them to be. And then I can start making those adjustments on the lighting and all of that, because if you don't have something placed and then you change your mind on where you want the placement done, then you have to redo all of the lighting work all over again. Okay, so clearly my son's legs were way too high, so I chose to just puppet warp him and bring his legs down. So I put a couple of pins in his upper torso and his hips to make sure that they stayed where I wanted them to be, and then I just dragged his feet and knees down to fit with the position of the robot's hand. And then I just placed a layer mask on him and painted off where his legs would be hidden by the robot's thumb. And then I just positioned the Snickers bar that I found on Pixel Squid to be in my son's pocket. The reason why I went with the chocolate and the money was because this was actually based on one of my emoji projects, and the 3 emojis that I got was a robot, chocolate, and money. So I had to incorporate those in some way. And I didn't like how my son's jeans were just kind of bulging out at the back, so I put him into Liquify and just straightened out that bump in his jeans a little bit more. I used my Life of Avax headlight for the robot's eyes. And I got this one with a tutorial that I did with them, but you can actually go to Adobe Stock, and I searched headlights on black and it showed up with a lot of really good stock images that you could just like select out the headlamp and use it as a overlay. I will link a couple below that I think would work really easily and really well for that if you want to give it a try. I did with the brush though, I made a new paint layer and then selected my brush that I wanted to use and I just rotated it so it was at the correct angle of the robot's head. And then I just painted those on. I did 2 separate layers. I did one for the eye that would be shining behind his head, and then one for the eye in front. The eye light layers that I used, I had those on linear dodge, and I just kind of lowered the opacity and then painted again another paint layer to make his eye look like it was shining that light. Okay, so I basically have all the stock placed. There's a couple of trees that I do want to put in front still, but now that I basically have my son placed where I want him to be and the robot in the right placement, I started adding on those color balanced layers on each of those layers. So right now I'm just color balancing the robot, and because it's a nighttime scene, I like to add a lot of blues in there because all of those colors are going to be super subdued in the moonlight and in the dark. So I'm just adding a lot of blue and cyan into each of these layers. With my son though, on his color balance, I actually added more yellow because he is in the robot's light. So I added more yellow to him and a little bit of red. Still, his color matches quite well, and later on I do add a little bit more of that yellow tone into the light so that it matches even more. But he is a little bit brighter than the rest of the stock because he is right in that direct light. And what I do with him is I do darken him up a little bit as well. So I go into his brightness and contrast and I just darken him a little bit because he is in that direct light. His shadow is going to be quite deep. So I darkened him and then I added a little bit more contrast on him as well. Okay, and here is where I get to putting those trees in front of them. So on Pixel Squid, I actually didn't have any pine trees saved, but all I did is you can actually search right within the Pixel Squid app that you can download to your Photoshop, and you can search directly for the things you're looking for and it'll pop up with a bunch of them. I absolutely love this app, and it has saved me multiple times where I've forgotten to get certain stock or decided last minute to add a certain thing into the image. All right, I grouped all of those trees into a folder, and then I did a brightness and contrast layer on them to darken them so they match the rest of the scene. And then I added a color balance on there as well to add a little bit more blue and cyan. Right, and once I had all of this stock placed in the image, I then went down to the robot and started adding those highlight and shadow layers. So I made 2 new paint layers. I clipped those down to the robot. The first layer is always the shadows. I named it burn in this one, but the burn layer or shadow layer is always on multiply, and the highlight layer is always on overlay. And then with my dark brush, I just went in and started painting in those shadows. And then the opposite with the highlights, I went in with a white brush. Once I got the burn and highlight layers finished on the robot, I then clicked on the robot layer and added some noise just because the background, the sky was quite noisy, but the robot was very clean because it was from Pixel Squid. So to match those, I added some noise on there. Looks like I left it around 6%-ish and then hit OK. And right about here, I noticed that the two sky layers were of different grain as well. It looks like the clouds were a lot grainier than the star layer that I had on there as well. So I had to add some noise on the stars and moon area so that they matched up. So I added some grain onto that one as well. I had to move one of the robot eye layers in behind my son's layer because it was, over top of his layer because it was in behind before and it looked weird. So the light would be shining on him and kind of fading him out a little bit. So I had to move that layer. On that layer that I did move, I added a layer mask on it and then just with a really soft brush at a low percent, between 10 and 20%, I just painted it off of my sun slightly to blend it and make it not so harsh. And then I just repeated that same process with the other light that's behind my sun as well, just blending it and softening it a little bit. Alright, then I noticed that the trees, because the main light is the moonlight, which would backlight everything, and then the second light is from the robot's eyes, those trees in front would be quite dark. And so I lowered the brightness and contrast quite a bit more on those. Alright, and then I decided I needed to clean up a lot of the selection on that robot's hand, because this one was from Adobe stock, and so I just went in and painted out all the white that was still on the hand there. I decided that I didn't like the large money that I had in that corner, so I actually just made that piece of stock a lot smaller and like it was coming out of the suitcase. And then I did also decide that his suitcase, if it's open a little bit, maybe some other things would be falling out, so I grabbed another piece of stock that had some clothing and put some clothing coming out of his suitcase as well. Right, and then I just lined up the clothing stock with that zipper, and I did use puppet warp on it so that it aligned up with that zipper a little bit better as well. And of course, after I got the rest of that stock placed, I added that color balance and brightness and contrast layers on each of those stock and adjusted them to match, just making them darker since it's nighttime, and then adding more blue and cyan to add to that nighttime scene. Alright, so I was getting pretty close to the end of this project here. To finish them all up on each piece of stock, I'm adding those shadow and highlight layers. So I'm making a new paint layer and I'm right clicking on these layers and clipping them to the robot hand here, which is the piece of stock I'm working on. And again, highlights are always going to be on overlays, and burn/shadow layers will always be on multiply. I am selecting a dark tone and painting that on the burn layer at a low and soft brush. So around 10% and making it very soft. And I'm painting those shadows in. And obviously the parts that are kind of covered behind the trees will be darker. And because his light is the main source of light that's on his hand, the back of his hand would be very dark. And so that's what I'm adding here. All right, and on the highlight layers, I am going to select a very bright part of the robot. So the top of his head that's being right in direct moonlight, I selected that color, and then I'm just painting that on the tops of his hand and fingers because the light from his eyes would be shining directly on those parts of his hand. And so they're going to be quite bright, and that's why I'm adding that there. If you find that you've reached like a max of what you can do on one layer, it's totally okay to add a second highlight layer and add more highlights in, and that's what I do here. I found that it wasn't getting much brighter, and I need that tip of his thumb to be really bright, and so I added a second layer. Right, and then I moved on to the other pieces of stock, like the suitcase here, the money, the pants, and I did the same thing with the highlight and burn layers. All right, and of course, I added a highlight and burn layer on my son as well, and that's what I'm working on here. Because the light is shining on my son's face, that would be the brightest part of him, and of course his back would be in deep shadow because no light would be touching his back. And here I'm just adding in those bright highlights to accentuate that the light is shining directly on him. So the tip of his nose, his forehead, the tops of his legs would all be very bright. And that brings us to the end of our Iron Giant tutorial. I really hope you guys liked this month's tutorial. I had so much fun working on this one with my little boy. And I will see you guys in the next tutorial. The next tutorial will be Kiki. Yay!